Alright, so I'm back from work, I'm in the shop, and today we're going to put in the anti-roll bar from Chassis Engineering into the Camaro. Alright, so I'm back in the garage, back home from being at work. We're going to get right back into working on the race car to get it ready for June. Hopefully we're allowed to travel by then and we can go to some other tracks and race. But if not, there's some races scheduled here, so we'll get the race there. While I was away, the new anti-roll bar came in for the back of the car, so let's open up the box and see what's in there. Alright, so with everything organized here in the box, I checked out, everything is there that we need. We got some bushings, rod ends, bolts, brackets and tabs, and the tubing. So we'll start going through the instructions now, get it all laid out, and we'll try to get together and on the car. Okay, so an anti-roll bar is designed to take the roll out of the body compared to the axle, which is on the ground. So as the torque comes on the engine, the car shifts, kind of raises the driver's side front wheel and plants a lot of power to the passenger side rear wheel. So what the anti-roll bar does is keeps the chassis square to the rear end, so as it launches, it kind of launches evenly. Alright, so I'm up under the car here now, and we're going to do some planning as to where the sway bar will fit. We have to make sure we clear the tire, all the 4-link bars and brackets, as well as the coilover shocks. So this bracket comes with the kit. It connects the sway bar to the end links that go to the rear end housing. So if we hold that up to figure out where it's going to fit best in underneath the car here, I already did some planning, but I believe we're going to have to put the sway bar forward of the axle up in this area, which has lots of structural support. It's triangulated, very strong part of the car. So if we can weld the brackets there for the sway bar, that puts it up here, out of the way of the suspension, and we'll have enough room between the tire and the 4-link brackets to bring it out so that it'll connect to the rear end housing between the tire and the 4-link bracket. So that's the plan, so we can start kind of mocking up the tubing and get some cuts and stuff fabricated up. Okay, so we know where the sway bar is going to sit in the car now. We got that planned out. So now we can start the bracketry and assembling the rod and tubes. So the first step is to make up the brackets that go from the sway bar out to the end links and down to the rear end housing. So I mocked this one up here in place with the tubing that goes between the two brackets to keep it set up. And I got a rod end in this end to set the depth properly between the two plates. So I got everything cleaned up, sanded, and ready to weld. So now we'll start welding that. We just weld around the outside of each of those tubes, and those brackets will be ready to go. Okay, so that's one bracket there made up. Now we'll just do the same thing again, and we'll have both brackets done. Okay, so these brackets are all completely welded and cleaned up, ready to go. So we're gonna move on to the sway bar brackets that mount the bar to the chassis of the car. So that consists of two parts. This first part, which is these two are bolted together, mount to the car, welded to the car, and then these two brackets bolt to this bracket that's bolted to the car, and those are welded to the sway bar. So what we got to do is, since we don't need a cross member in the car, we can skip that step, which means we can take out make this bracket a little shorter so it'll fit underneath. So I'll cut it along that line with the grinder, and then we'll be able to weld these tabs right to the car. So I'll get these cleaned up, and I'll get these cleaned up, and then we have to weld some bushings on there, and then I'll be ready to go to the car. Okay, so I got the bracket trim that mounts to the chassis of the car, and I bolted up the sway bar bracket to it. So now what we have to do is weld these bushings all the way around. Gives the bolt more surface area to hold, so when the twisting action happens, it can transfer the load through the bolt into the brackets. So we'll get these welded up, they're already cleaned. We'll start welding those, and then we can bring these over to the car and get them fitted up. finished welding the bushings onto the brackets. Everything's tight and I bolted it up. And then I slid the brackets over the pipe that holds up the sway bar. So what we'll do now is we'll go under and fit this where it needs to be. I already went under, marked out where it's gonna be. I basically set the distance off of the rear end housing and marked it on the tubing on the chassis where it's gotta go. So what I did was took this arm, measured the distance center to center from this hole to the bottom hole, and then I basically measured off the center line of the rear end housing and then over the distance. So I got a mark here where it's going to be center. So what we'll do is we'll try to get this tubing up in place and welded so I can keep the center line of the bracket and the sway bar in line with that, which gives us the right distance off the rear end housing. Okay, so I got the tabs welded to the chassis, just tack welded for now. Make sure everything's square and fits upright. So what I'll do now is I'll do some more measurements off the center line of the rear end housing to the center line of this tubing. Make sure it's the same on both sides, and then we can go ahead and move to the next step, the install. Okay, so I got the brackets finished welded there, tight to the chassis of the car. Both sides welded. So we're ready to measure for the actual length of the sway bar we're gonna use. So we'll mock that up, get the length we need, cut it, mount it, and move on. Okay, so I did some figuring and measuring, and the length of sway bar we need to clear the 4-link brackets, the tire, and everything underneath the car, and to keep it as long as we can, I'm gonna go with 21.5 inches side to side. So this 1.25 inch tubing, pretty heavy wall. This is the actual anti-roll bar. So I'll cut that at 21.5. Then I can cut the mounting tube here 2.5 inches shorter than that. So we'll cut this tube at 19 inches and then we're ready to go to the next step. So I got the mounting bar and the sway bar itself both cut to the length. I welded the mounting tabs onto the mounting bar and got the brass bushings in place. So this is ready to go to the car. Now the sway bar, what we'll do is we'll clean up the ends and mount the arm to one end, then we'll slide it through, mount the other arm to the other end, and then it can go onto the car and we can work on brackets to get it down to the rear end housing. Okay, so after some fitment issues and getting it figured out here, I got the sway bar completed. There it is. So bushings are in each end. The arms are welded solid to the sway bar, goes through, brackets are all on. So now what we can do is bolt this up in the car and work on the mounts to the rear end housing from those ends. Okay, so I mocked up the brackets that go to the rear end housing from the arms, the sway bar arms. So I got the tack welded this bracket in place on the rear end housing, and I measured the distance from this rod end to the upper rod end, and it's 3.25 inches. So what we'll do now is we'll cut this tube to 3.25 inches, fit it on the rod ends, bolt it in the car, and then that'll give us the perfect straight position to solid weld these brackets to the rear end. Okay, so I cut the tubing to length and pressed in the threaded ends here. So I'm going to test fit this on the car, make sure it's the right length, and then I'll solid weld the ends right to the tubing. Okay, so I got both links welded up to the rod ends. So now we can go, bring them over to the car, bolt them on, and I can tack weld the brackets to the rear end housing. Okay, so we got the sway bar completely installed, all the bolts tight, the end links tight to the rear end brackets welded to the rear end. So it's all ready to go. It's both rod ends are loose right now with the car hanging, and everything's pretty close. So to do the final adjustment, we'll have to get it on the ground with the weight on the car, and then just crank these until the sway bar is parallel to the bottom 4-link bracket, which should be parallel to the ground. And then we'll tighten up the jam nuts and it'll be good to go. We're underneath the car. You can see that the Sway bar is in position, everything looks good. So I'll just make sure that there's no load on the rod ends right now, and it's good to go. Okay, with the car on the ground, you've seen that the sway bar was parallel with the ground, which was good. So we took the load out of the rod ends so that they were loose, tightened up the lock nuts so they'll stay where they are now. Needs a coat of paint, but other than that, the sway bar is installed. So we'll see what happens when we take it to the track.